Determinism and Free Will. References to thinkers and books in my lectures may be found on AtheistScholar.org, Determinism and Free Will, in the bibliography and footnotes. One of the most compelling debates of the present day is the one between determinism and free will. Questions of this issue reach back for centuries. But the current controversy has been sparked by new theories in physics and science that question whether or not the universe is determined and what freedoms humans have as part of that natural system. There are the philosophical arguments and the theological ones. We shall try to present a glance this evening of both schools. I will give a summary of what many theists believe concerning free will and the nature of the God they believe in, and then I'm going to move into the secular and academic philosophical issue of free will and determinism with an overview of some of the most important and strong thinkers in the field. The theist positions are done less than a quarter of the way through the lecture if you wish to pass over them. I would like to say that I am, until there is more evidence, a compatibilist on the question. I will be giving definitions for the different types of determinism and free will, but a compatibilist is someone who believes we are somewhat determined, but that we also have room for human decision making. I will not be offering any conclusions tonight, just a balanced glance at both the thinking involved in determinism and free will. There have been many advances in learning how the human brain functions that have put the concept of free will into question, but there is no hard evidence as yet that has put the issue to rest, and there does not seem to be any forthcoming for the near future. I am of the thinking that until we are presented with hard facts into the nature of human consciousness and human behavior, it is better to view the many arguments, pro and con, with some agnosticism. Atheists remain divided on the question of free will. Many secular thinkers do not find the idea of human free will a robust one. Others are convinced of the will's free agency. Many atheists now maintain a compatibilist stance that intention and choice are possible within a determinist system. The issue is complicated for atheists by their mistrust of theistic concepts, particularly the notion of an immortal soul, which is somehow transposed on the body in a supernatural manner and makes choices independent of the material working of the brain. Atheists generally believe that the mind is a function of the instantiated brain, and the idea of a little man making decisions somewhere in the brain is not a salient one. They do not accept the explanations from prominent Christian theologians such as Alvin Plantinga, who maintain that free will is so necessary that it justifies the existence of moral evil. Plantinga states that it was not within God's power to create a world containing moral good and no moral evil. I have discussed Plantinga's thinking before at some length in my earlier lecture, What is Atheism, and Arguments for and Against the Existence of God. It is also in the same name section of AtheistScholar.org. Such theological arguments, combined with the mythical fall from paradise, when Adam and Eve freely chose to disobey divine command, make some atheists desire to dissociate themselves from any libertarian stance concerning the will. It is important for secular thinkers to keep in mind that the free will concept was not the only current running through theological thinking. It is necessary to keep the true two strands of Christian thinking concerning free will and predestination in mind. Quite often, secular discussions of free will and determinism focus on the Christian idea of free will and ignore the determinist stance of many Christian churches. The theologian and church father Augustine was not a believer in free will, although he mitigated his position somewhat with ideas of choice. Calvin, the 16th century Protestant reformer and founder of Calvinism, was what is called a hard determinist, stating definitely that man had no free will. The 16th century theologian Martin Luther did not believe in free will, but rather predestination, although his stance was somewhat softer than Calvin's. Many Christian theologians found the idea of free will was an antipathetic idea, as it placed too much limit on God's omnipotence. However, theist philosophy did not reject the idea of the immortal soul, a concept secular thinkers do not consider coherent. At any rate, free will was a knotty problem for theologians. Many theists did not just consider free will problematical, they found it intolerable that God's will, or even the inference of God's will, would be limited in any manner. They felt that even the suggestion of the slightest nudge in the direction of free will would demonstrate that God's power was not supreme. For a human to behave well and have a subsequent reward in paradise was seen by such theists as a limitation of divine power. There are still theist theologians who reject such a libertarian concept, stating that for a human to attain salvation by his or her own acts would, in a real sense, force God's hand. God would of necessity be obliged to open the pearly gates, as it were, rather than granting salvation by his independent act. It was God who had to choose, and not puny humans. But what sense, others thought, is there in the idea of reward and punishment in the next world if people embrace such a concept of God deciding who would be a candidate for future reward? There would be nothing left to base such a choice on. It would not matter if people behaved well or badly in this world. Those who were proponents of God's choice alone hedged by implying that the godliness of people's behavior would be a good guide to understanding who had been chosen for salvation. As James Garvey notes, an omniscient, omnipotent, all-good God would seem to point to a belief in determinism. A God who knows everything will know future outcomes, including the choices we make, which determine those outcomes. This idea would seem to include the choices we make before we make them. Some theists state that just because God knows the choices people make before they make them does not necessarily mean God causes them to make those choices. They could choose to act differently. Still, for many, such choices are really not choices at all. We will enlarge on this in a couple of minutes. These positions are rather paradoxical. Either we aren't free and God will know what we will do before we do it, or our choices are made freely by us, and as we have said, would seem to limit God's power and knowledge. As Garvey states, something must give in this proposition. For theists who do not want to give up the notion of God's total power, human freedom must go. Then it is worth repeating, without some measure of human freedom, the sense anyone can make of the concept of divine punishment, divine reward, is very dubious. The question of free will takes us back to the problem of evil, natural, such as earthquakes and typhoons, and human or moral evil. We have on one hand a God with all the aforementioned three qualities, all good, all powerful, all knowing, and yet, as we have seen in the previous lecture on arguments concerning God's existence, we have the problem of evil existing in the world. We saw in that earlier lecture that natural evil is a huge, nearly insurmountable stumbling block for the question of God being real. Many theists wriggle around the difficulty by explaining physical evil as a test for humans. It is a struggle against hardship, they intone, that purifies the soul. In our previous lecture, we dealt with this concept. What kind of test is the creation of severely disabled children? One can make a shaky case that it's a test for the parents. But if the child is severely brain damaged, what test is it for the child? We see the non-lucidity of that concept. I should say that the concept is not lucid for the secular mind. Many theists still embrace it. As for the theory of free will and moral evil, Theist defenders find such a notion within the parameters of their belief in God's complete beneficence. They argue that free will is a good in itself and that it is our fault if we choose to throw it away by choosing evil actions. Atheist philosophers retort that if God is so all-knowing, he should have known how catastrophic it would be to create humans with the capacity to freely choose evil. And further argue the atheologist, why did he not design us with the ability to freely choose good? The replies and counter-replies rage on and on. As we have seen, both Augustine and Aquinas, formidable Christian apologists, argued that we too often forget the difference between knowing what will happen and causing it to happen. God knows what we are going to do because we are going to do it. He is not causing our future actions to happen. He only sees them. Both of these theists explain our human difficulty in understanding God's all-powerfulness and determinism are because of our concepts of temporal categories which do not apply to God. God, they insist, is in his eternity, which enables him to see all events at once, in other words, outside or independently of time. There is no God's knowing before we choose something, because before is not applicable to God and knowledge. And that is that, which, however, is not a salient argument for the secular mind. These theist considerations point to a great degree of determinism, which was around before Judaism and Christianity. Some of the Christian church fathers likely were aware of a few early Greek philosophers who had the notion that a good creator could only create a good world set on a fixed path. The Stoics also believed nature was not only divine, but cyclical. They thought that nature had both cycles of life and cycles of the end of everything, which came about with fiery conflagration. These cycles were eternal. Furthermore, the Stoics' famous indifference to life's ups and downs was partially due to their belief that whatever happened, whether personal or to others, or to life itself, was good, for the good and ultimate purposes of the universe. We know that the Christian church borrowed and adapted from Stoic philosophy. There is a classic thought experiment that is appropriate to mention here. It influenced medieval theologians and helped them with their arguments for free will. Jean Bourdain was a thinker during the Middle Ages. His dates were 1300 to 1358. He helped begin what thinkers still call the liberty of indifference. Bourdain never put this idea to the test of empirical evidence. He stated that if he put a hungry donkey between two piles of hay, both equally distant and both delicious looking, the donkey would starve to death. This is because he would not have any basis for choosing between options. Sometimes the tale is changed to hay and water. The thought experiment goes back to the Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali, 1058 to 1111. Neither Bourdain nor Al-Ghazali had this experiment in mind for free will arguments. However, Peter Olivi, 1248 to 1298, and Duns Scotus, 1266 to 1308, used this idea as a basis for a libertarian idea of free will. Humans, they maintained, would have the ability to break the putative tie. Since both options had equal appeal, a human would choose one and leave the other. They both argued that only humans have that kind of choice. Animals, they maintained, cannot deliberate, and the donkey would likely starve to death. In the unlikely event that the donkey did make a choice, it would be by a different method of deliberation, because only humans have true free will, which was really the point of the argument, not that the donkey would starve. We all know that that donkey would eat as much as he could of the hay from both piles until he was stuffed. Another absurd concept, at least for the secular community, is Leibniz's, the 17th and 18th century philosopher, who argued in a similar manner to some earlier philosophers that since God is the ultimate good and he created this world with all the things in it, that this is the best of all possible worlds, the only one God could have created. Voltaire, the Enlightenment philosopher, mocked this provincially optimistic viewpoint in his masterpiece Candide, 1759, in which many moral and physical evils befall Candide the hero, as well as his friends. I leave it to my listeners to determine which is the most ridiculous piece of thinking, Al-Ghazali and Bourdain's or Leibniz. It is a complete toss-up. Moving beyond theology, the question of whether man's nature is at one with the material, causal world, or whether a person can make decisions and choices of his own volition, remains a pressing one for secular thinkers in the present day. Professor Roy Weatherford states that the problem is really two difficulties, one metaphysical and the other ethical and in many ways attitudinal in kind. Newton's discovery of the laws of gravity seemed to confirm that not only was the universe causal, but determined. This concept was what is termed the clockwork theory of the universe. All matter in motion in space, obeying a set of causal laws. Since humans were part of nature, there was an assumption that they too were determined, that not only their past, but their future was fixed. They were as determined in their movements as the particles of matter moving in the space of the predetermined universe. The 20th century began to move beyond the earlier view of a determined universe. Einstein's theory of relativity, 1915 to 1916, began to make scientists focus on the concept that their theories and ideas are devices to organize and understand observations of the cosmos, and that scientific conceptions are not necessarily what really is. In 1927, Heisenberg published his uncertainty principle, which implies that it is impossible to determine simultaneously both the position and the momentum of an electron or any other particle with any great degree of accuracy or certainty. Chaos theory, too, was discovered in the 20th century, which maintains that events occur randomly and by chance at the most fundamental level of the material world. Chaos theory began as a field study in applied mathematics with applications in physics, economics, biology, and philosophy. New concepts in physics brought about by quantum mechanics opened up a completely new worldview. What the discovery of indeterminacy at the micro level of nature says about human freedom is very problematical. Indeterminacy seems to operate principally at the micro level and not extend beyond it. Furthermore, although the movement of particles does not appear to be determined, it is certainly not what can be called freedom in any salient sense. It is rather more of a swerve, random and apparently chaotic. Humans could not function properly if their systems operated in the manner of particles. Such so-called freedom is virtually useless to human organisms. Most of the sciences today still work under the assumption of causality and determinism, with physics being the exception. Determinism seems to prevail at the macro level. There is an interesting point of view that entertains the concept that determinism, or at least the belief in it, hinges on our perception of the world, that we really cannot function without it. Some philosophers maintain that it is an integral part of human thinking about the world. We humans understand the physical universe with the assumption that every event has a cause. Seeing the world causally seems to be part of the human condition. While David Hume, the skeptical philosopher, denied causation in the world in the strictest sense of the word, he also maintained that humans must see the world in a causal manner, that it is a habit or predilection which we cannot help. He concluded that we cannot help thinking otherwise. Kant stated that the principle of universal causation is a fundamental category of the understanding that it was one of the ways we analyze the world. Kant believed that this was the only way we could analyze the object we sought to understand. Seeing the world in terms of cause and effect is the only way we have of understanding it. At the same time, Kant stated that freedom is the precondition of our action, that it is necessary when we must act. Kant is very scintillating on such points of freedom combined with action, or rather the belief in freedom. He believes there is a large difference between thinking about objects or things and thinking about action. To try to understand the world, Kant thinks determinism is necessary to humans. But to contemplate doing something, action, or praxis, the concept of free will is necessary. Some philosophers maintain that Kant has merely emphasized and pointed out the problem, but does not in any way resolve it. Both Kant and Hume, both giants of perception, think that we humans are unable to give up determinism. The question they imply is a closed one. The same difficulties apply, though, to the question of free will. We experience this sense of freedom from the inside. James Garvey makes a telling point. However much we can't give up cause and effect when we try to make sense of the world, we also have enormous difficulty accepting that our inner experience of freedom is an illusion. It does seem that within ourselves we can accept or reject an action, that we have a choice, and that we exercise it. Keep in mind that Kant maintained such a belief, even if illusory, is necessary. We shall encounter another large figure in the contemporary discussion of determinism and free will, who believes there is no free will, but that the illusion of it is a necessity, later in the lecture, Shaul or Saul Smilansky. Thinking about such issues, and particularly contemporary physics and uncertainty principles, brings me to James Garvey again, the British philosophy professor. He states in his elegant prose, "The things at the level of everyday observation seem bound up by causal laws, whether or not this is so for the particles of which they are composed." Before the lecture discusses the contemporary issues and important thinkers involved in discussions of free will and determinism, it is necessary to define a few terms that most scholars are generally agreed on. These definitions will help to follow the strands of modern philosophic thought that encompass free will and determinism. Hard determinism maintains that human actions and character are wholly determined by external factors, that humans have no free will or responsibility. Soft determinism believes that human behavior is wholly determined by causal events, but human free will does exist when defined by the capacity to act according to one's nature, shaped by heredity, society, and upbringing. Free will is a philosophical term for a particular sort of capacity of rational agents to choose a course of action among various alternatives. Acting with free will on such views is to satisfy the metaphysical requirements of being responsible for one's actions. There are many constraints and resistances outside ourselves, so our success in carrying out our ends seem to reside in our willing. Metaphysical libertarians state that determinism is false and only free will exists. They are known as indeterminists. Both libertarians and hard determinists are described as incompatibilists. Kant's separation of the two ways of viewing our nature still seems to operate in our contemporary world. We have learned about genetic determination, social and environmental factors, and the unconscious part of our minds. We know the large role such factors play in our development as humans. We know that our minds and thoughts, consciousness itself, are functions of our material brain. We understand the mind and the brain are not separate entities. And yet, we unwittingly think of ourselves as free and our choices as self-determined. we see alternate choices before us. Robert Kane states that we believe we have free will when we think A, it is up to us when we choose from an array of alternative possibilities, and B, the origins or sources of our choices and actions are in us, and not in anything or anyone over which we have no control. We believe that other people have free will also, as can be witnessed by our feelings of gratitude, resentment, and so on, when we are the recipients of others' actions. There is a category of philosophers who believe that free will and determinism do not need to be at odds. They are known as compatibilists. I have mentioned them earlier and placed myself in that category. However, as more evidence emerges, I can easily accept what the facts tell me I must. Those of us who put some trust in science will change our minds with emerging and conclusive evidence if need be. Thomas Hobbes, the 18th century author of Leviathan, asserted that no liberty can be inferred to the will, desire, or inclination but the liberty of the man, which consists in this, that he finds no stop in doing what he has the will, desire, or inclination to do. David Hume agreed, and he stated, "This hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains." Hume and Hobbes were both compatibilists. The lecture will discuss the ideas of two contemporary well-regarded compatibilists, Daniel C. Dennett and Harry Frankfurt, below. The somewhat abstract philosophical terms and concepts that we have been following are actually extremely important concerning ethics and the question of responsibility in the present day. If everything is caused, how can there be standards for behavior? This is particularly true for the question of personal and legal responsibility. Michael Gazzaniga, the author of The Ethical Brain, The Science of Our Moral Dilemmas, 2006, has devoted an entire chapter of his volume to the issue of responsibility, in particular, legal responsibility. What we have learned about brain functioning in recent years has directed us to issues of diminished capacity. Gazzaniga is a well-known neuroscientist who served on the President's Council on Bioethics. He discusses the fact that there are cases of brain damage on record which have changed people's personalities. He also deals at length with the considerations concerning the fact that our body frequently moves to carry out a task or reach for something a few milliseconds before our brain registers the conscious thought. There is the famous Libet experiment in the 1980s. Benjamin Libet measured brain activity while human subjects carried out voluntary hand movements and found that the brain carries out its work before one becomes aware of a thought. His results were very disconcerting, as Libet found that between 500 and 1,000 milliseconds before we move our hands, there is a wave of brain activity called the readiness potential. So then Libet set out to determine the time t, which is somewhere in those 500 to 1,000 milliseconds when we make the conscious decision to move our hand. Time t is the moment the subject becomes aware of his or her movement. He used a technique called event-related potential, or ERPs, to measure his subjects' brains while they made conscious hand movements, which were also voluntary. Actually, it was pretty simple. Each subject would stare at a clock, and at the very moment he made a conscious decision to flick his wrist, he would also note the position of a black dot, say at the 5 or 53 marks, and then report this sequence to the experimenter. Libet then would correlate that moment with the recorded time when the subject's brainwave pattern showed a readiness potential. Libet's findings, as I said, were pretty disconcerting. Even before time t, the moment the subject consciously decided to make the hand movement, the brain was active. Gazzaniga reports the time between the onset of the readiness potential and the moment of conscious decision-making was about 300 milliseconds. So it seems that our brains know about our decisions before we consciously make them. Such an experimental result would seem to argue that our concept of free will is an illusion. But matters are a little more complex than that. Here is Libet's argument. Because the time from the onset of the readiness potential to the actual hand movement is about 500 milliseconds, and it takes 50 to 100 milliseconds for the neural signal to travel from the brain to the hand to actually make the hand move, 100 milliseconds are left for the conscious will to either go with the unconscious decision or veto it. Libet decided that our free will lay in the veto power of those milliseconds. The noted neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran, who Richard Dawkins has called the Marco Polo of physics, has made an argument similar to that of John Locke's, the 17th century empirical philosopher's theory of free will. Ramachandran has said that our conscious mind may not have free will, but free won't. Gazzaniga also reports on Michael Platt and Paul Glimcher's work at New York University. They studied monkey brains and examined the activity of neurons in the inferior parietal lobule. Their experience had lent more credence to the idea that the brain acts on its own before we become consciously aware of its actions, according to Gazzaniga. Every neuron in this lobule has a receptive field that has a preference for one area of the visual field over others. When a monkey fixes its gaze on a spot and the experimenter flashes a bar of light around on the wall, there will be one place, for example, 5 inches above or 5 inches below, that the neuronal activity increases, fires signals at a higher rate than anywhere else. When the experimental light is in that area, the cell fires signals, we are told, like a machine gun, and ceases its activity when the bar of light is withdrawn. These neurons in this lobule change fire patterns based on the size of the reward likely to be given. The experiments were long and carried out frequently, so they seem to confirm that this area of the brain plays a critical role in deciding to act or not. The neurons are not passive, but seem to be tied to the purpose of the movement and may, and here I quote Gazzaniga, actively aid in the decision process, which happens before each animal gives a hint about what it is deciding to do. The automatic brain appears to be working in these experiments. There are also studies and experiments which seem to point to reduced culpability in humans, especially in many violent crimes. Yet Gazzaniga believes that neuroscience will not find the brain correlate of responsibility because he believes that this quality is something we ascribe to people, not brains. He states that responsibility is a social construct that involves humans interacting with each other. He concludes that the idea of responsibility, a social construct that exists in the rules of a society, does not exist in the neuronal structures of the brain. Libet himself believed that the idea of the existence of free will is as good as any denial of it by determinists. Since both theories are speculative, he is on the record prior to his death that until real contradictory evidence appears, we can adopt the concept of free will. He finds the hard determinism that views humans as machines completely controlled by known physical laws a permissive and not robust concept. Additionally, Al Mealy, a philosopher at Florida State University, thinks that Libet's conclusions lacked what he calls conceptual clarity. It's interesting that philosophers believe they can help neuroscience with this issue of the will. They might be correct. According to Mealy, Libet lumped together urges, intentions, decisions, wanting, and so on. At the very least, Mealy thinks we can distinguish between conscious intentions and urges. I may want to go to a concert to hear a lecture with one friend, and I may want to go to a jazz concert with another. But both events are on the same night at the same time. Assuming that I'm fairly normal mentally, I know I cannot be in both places at once. I must pick one. I may want to order a large pizza at a restaurant and also want a large order of a veggie burger with fries and slaw. Unless I am very hungry or greedy, my most intelligent choice will be to pick one of these items. I have multiple urges, but my intention will be to go to one place or order one dish at any one time. Mealy also interprets the Libet results in an original way. Those readiness potentials we see in the Libet are urges to prepare to move our hands, or actually in the Libet, flex our wrists. You have the urge to flex, but that small time span is a veto, an intention not to follow through on the urge. The urge is vetoed, and so a full-fledged intention is never formed. Mealy is very common sense in his explanation. The motor system is getting ready for an action if I decide to perform that action. I am not locked into a position, or rather my motor system is not locked into a position, but is simply getting ready in case I make a conscious decision or intent, in which case I will be ready to initiate the action. Mealy is working on a project at the moment with Professor Lucille T. Workmeister at Florida State entitled The Big Questions in Free Will Project. Please keep in mind, this project has been partially funded by the Templeton Foundation with a $4.4 million grant. This is Mealy and his project's full disclosure. He is currently looking into the science of free will, the underpinnings of a concept of free will, and the theological issues concerning free will. He also wrote a Templeton essay not too long ago stating that if we find proof of determinism, we will have to live with it, but he did not think that would be the case. Mealy maintains that free will is both true and morally beneficial. When I hear such ameliorating claims, I become skeptical. But it is one more addition to the argument. Colin McGinn, the outspoken atheist philosopher, and by now you know a favorite of mine, makes a very telling point when he states that the identifying the part of the brain that makes a decision tells us nothing about the concept of freedom. McGinn maintains that freedom is a conceptual problem, not a neural one. I'm going to glance at some of the top thinkers in the field of free will and determinism and try to make their sometimes very complex views accessible to us in this lecture. I will move from the proponents of determinism to those of free will and then to compatibilism. In the case of the Strawsons, Peter, the father, and Gawlin, his son, I will have to compress the two into one small section, even though Gawlin Strawson is a well-known and respected determinist. Derek Pierboom from Cornell is a pretty hard determinist. But even though he believes humans are determined and do not have moral responsibility for their actions, he is not pessimistic in the least. He believes that if we accept this idea, we might be happier and create a better adjusted society. He makes many good points in his writings. He says we will not value good acts or people with excellent characters because of abandoning the idea of free will. We will value athletic, artistic, and musical ability in people, and yet we know that many such skills are innate, such as high intelligence, another valued trait. Even love will survive, he maintains, the shift from belief in free will to determinism. After all, he states, parents love their children and do not necessarily need to be loved in return. Love between adults is based on so many factors that he is sure it will survive. In fact, romantic love may be caused by processes that are in no way even felt or affected by the shift to determinism. He believes there will be very few consequences if and when the free will belief is finished. Daniel M. Wegner is the author of The Illusion of Conscious Will, 2003. Wegner tries to demonstrate how the feeling of willing arrives for people. He explains that if our thoughts happen before an action, are consistent with that action, and we don't see other likely causes, we decide that we did the action. Wegner proceeds to demonstrate with many examples that this so-called causation on our parts is just not so. Wegner cites examples from past studies showing how we think our free thoughts cause an action, such as movement on Ouija boards. The movement we believe our thoughts caused is in actuality muscle action, or what is called ideomotor influence. Wegner cites a telling contemporary study. Two participants wearing headsets hear names of objects while pushing a computer mouse around on a board filled with pictures. They can make the mouse stop any time they want. One participant, however, is a Confederate tester and sometimes stops the mouse on a particular picture. The true participant rates how strongly she believes she chose the stopping place. At any time the picture's name was heard before the mouse stopped, the innocent participant believed she had caused the stop. Wegner also demonstrates that once people are told not to think of white bears, they have a hard time not thinking about white bears. This little white bear experiment is resonant of Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Imp of the Perverse, in which the narrator states, "We stand upon the brink of a precipice. We peer into the abyss. We grow sick and dizzy. Our first impulse is to shrink away from the danger. Unaccountably we remain. It is but a thought, although a fearful one, and one which chills the very marrow of our bones with the fierceness of the delight of its horror. It is merely the idea of what would be our sensations during the sweeping precipitancy of a fall from such a height. For this very cause do we now the most vividly desire it." Professor Wegner is a clear and entertaining writer, and his book is replete with interesting examples of how our brain tricks us into thinking our conscious thoughts cause our actions. He is a determinist who is convinced that, as his book title announced, our conviction of conscious will is completely illusory. Richard Double is the author of Metaphilosophy and Free Will, 1996, which is a tantalizing new look at philosophy and the question of free will and determinism. Double looks at what he terms 4 philosophical positions of metaphilosophy and tries to demonstrate how their differences may contribute to making the free will problem unsolvable. In this volume, the author describes the varied metaphilosophical views of what the point of philosophy is. He maintains that the free will determinism debate cannot be discussed intelligibly until the aims of metaphilosophy are understood. His 4 putative stances are: philosophy is conversation, to say interesting things. Philosophy is practice, or praxis, to create improvement rather than search for truth. Philosophy is underpinning, which attempts to underpin such things as common sense and tries to protect such concepts by making them immune from criticism. Finally, he describes number 4, philosophy is worldview construction, where the aim is to discover the truth no matter how dull, unedifying, or outrageous to common sense. The non-truth tracking philosophies are 1 to 3. Double claims the adherents of such stances won't give up their views even if they are shown to be false. He believes that they place some other aim above truth. This argument is too theoretical. Would the proponents of the 1 to 3 philosophies not give up their ideas if they were shown to be untrue? Double claims they would not, but does not prove it. Indeed, proof of such a charge is very difficult. Double maintains that determinists want to attain a clear and true description of the world. He believes that free will proponents are bent on preserving free will because they feel they are protecting morals and ethics, and that their position has very little to do with objectivity. He spends the last part of the book arguing for his position of free will subjectivism, which he believes will bring some balance to the issue of free will and determinism. Double's book is jargon-free and his arguments cogent. He deconstructs the free will arguments with a sharp pen. Whether the reader agrees with the volume's conclusions or not, it is an interesting look at how philosophic generalities may be influencing the free will question more than we realize. Robert Cain has written a contemporary introduction to free will in 2005. This volume was designed as a textbook, and many readers and critics find it an excellent one. Cain is one of the foremost philosophers undertaking a defense of libertarian free will. His book is even-handed, presenting explanations of determinism and compatibility as well as free will. Cain discusses self-forming actions, actions that allow people to shape their own wills. These actions translate into ultimate responsibility. A free act is an act we can claim responsibility for, and we must have sufficient reason for choosing it. Cain takes a position of people having ultimate power over their acts. He argues that free wills are made by us, that they are our creation. This deeper freedom differs from surface freedom, which consists of choosing without physical or legal restrictions. When people exercise deeper freedom, they demonstrate that they have responsibility rather than having their actions determined by genes, environment, or a creator. Cain discusses free will as it applies to religious views of predestination and omniscience also. Some readers find that Cain's argument concerning the deeper freedom is not as robust as they would have wanted. Most readers appreciate Cain's even-handedness when discussing determinism and compatibility. The book is also a technical introduction to philosophy in its terms, which is helpful to armchair readers on the debate between free will and determinism. Cain's position on free will is not always easy to understand, so this book of his, accessible and not as complexly written as some of his work, is a wonderful introduction to a salient idea of free will. Cain is also the compiler of the Oxford Handbook of Free Will from 2002. He is an excellent editor of this thick volume of essays by top scholars in the field of free will and compatibility. The book is a welcome contribution to the discussion of free will versus determinism. Cain's introductory chapter allows the reader to become acquainted with the array of topics in the field, and the book emphasizes the most recent research. The essayists are all highly regarded scholars in their respective areas of study, and the writing is clear and relatively easy to understand. There is a very thorough bibliography at the end, which helps readers who want to pursue more books in the free will and determinism dispute. The 8 chapters encompass vital issues for readers involved in the contemporary free will debate. Included is the recent work on the theological implications of the debate, the latest scientific thinking, quantum and chaos theories, consequence, important in determinism, compatibilist theories, Frankfurt and other moral responsibility concepts, libertarian ideas of free will, non-standard views such as Shaul Smilansky's stance that free will is a necessary illusion, and the recent thinking of neuroscience on the issues. Some of the writers are Daniel Dennett and Derek Pierboom, as well as other well-known scholars. This handbook brings the readers up to date on the philosophic issues of free will and compatibilism, as well as determinism. My other recommendation is the Great Courses class taught by Sean Nichols, which is a must for people interested in a thorough grounding in the free will and determinism issue. Professor Nichols is interesting, incredibly knowledgeable, and even-handed in his treatment of the various schools of thought. He makes very complex ideas extremely accessible. See AtheistScholar.org, the bibliography and book list for the particulars to both these references, as well as many other volumes on both sides of the debate. In an argument close to one aspect of David Hume's, whom we discussed earlier this evening, in which Hume talks of resentment and blame in humans, Peter Strawson, the late English philosopher, developed a theory in the early 1960s which is still cogent in contemporary circles. This Strawson case is interesting because both Peter and his son Galen are highly esteemed philosophers. But Strawson, the elder, defends a sustainment of resentment against wrongdoers because he believes in holding people morally responsible. His son gives one of the best rebuttals standing to that position. But first, let us look at Peter Strawson's very intelligent and sensible argument. He begins at the level of our interactions with people we are near on a day-to-day basis. We feel emotions when we deal with friends, family, colleagues, and neighbors, such as gratitude, resentment, outrage, love, and even forgiveness. Strawson calls these reactive attitudes because we have them as a reaction to the attitude we believe other people have toward us. He says they are natural reactions to the good or ill will or indifference of others toward us. When we feel another person's reactions reveal they don't respect us, we are resentful, and contrarily, if a person's reactions show they care for us, we react with gratitude. What is interesting in Strawson's position is that he holds that our resentment and gratitude reveal that we do hold people morally responsible for their actions. We do not think of actions being determined when we get angry at a slight or feel a warm gratitude for a favor. Strawson goes on to develop his arguments thus. There are exemptions we grant to people under certain conditions. Say someone bumps my head rather hard with his elbow and it is accidental. I do not feel resentment because it is accidental. But he is only exempt for this one-time accident. If he does something I deem deliberate, then he is a candidate, once again, for my resentment. We grant very small children a certain amount of exemption, even when their negative behavior to us is deliberate. If a very small child deliberately squirts a water pistol at me, getting an expensive t-shirt soaked, or ruining my blouse, after the first spurt of anger, I temper my resentment. After all, how can I really hold a 2-year-old responsible? Strawson notes other exemptions, such as not holding people with extreme psychological damage and conditions responsible. He also exempts people with diminished capacities. But the point of his argument is that all these cases are exceptions. Strawson echoes David Hume, who has a pithy remark about belief in determinism. Hume states, "A man who is robbed of a considerable sum, does he find his vexation for the loss anywise diminished by these sublime reflections about necessity?" Strawson is stronger on this point than Hume. He believes that giving everybody a pass does not make sense. He reiterates that the whole point of exemptions is that they are special, unusual cases. He concludes with 2 points. If we come to believe in determinism, would we give up the reactive attitudes? This is practically inconceivable, he says. His second point is this. If we do come to accept determinism, should we give up reactive attitudes? Strawson maintains that the only way to make such a decision would be in the light of an assessment of the gains and losses to human life. Would our lives be enhanced or deflated by giving up reactive attitudes? You see where this up to now excellent argument begins to falter. We will see such a segue again and again in the discussion between free will and determinism. We have seen it already this evening, beginning with Peerboom. These positions are very tricky. We still do not have a definitive truth concerning determinism, only how it affects our lives. Galen Strawson agrees on many points with his father, but he is an incompatibilist, while the elder Strawson may be considered a compatibilist. Galen Strawson makes the important observation that our reactions have the built-in supposition that people have indeterminate free will. He thinks that reflection on determinism does affect our emotional reactions. Say, for example, a jury must decide on a death sentence for a person who has committed a horrendous murder. The first impulse is to blame him. But then the defense tells the jury of his terrible upbringing, beatings, alcoholic parents, and so on. Then the jury learns he has learning disabilities and a low IQ, along with psychological problems. Could he have been any different than he is? A hard-headed, common-sense American jury might find him guilty, but decide on life rather than the death penalty. The legal questions raised by determinism and neuroscience will be complicated and frustrating in the years to come. Galen Strawson's position is hard to embrace. He apparently believes we cannot be or act other than what we are formed into. Personal responsibility is a useless claim for his point of view. And now we arrive at Shaul or Saul Smilansky, who has written Free Will and Illusion, 2000, and other challenging works. Smilansky's concept of free will is termed a non-standard one, and that is an understatement. He claims that illusory beliefs are in place in humans and the role they play is largely positive. He maintains that he neither thinks we need to induce illusory beliefs or claim that we live with beliefs we fully realize are illusory. He finds the latter two propositions improbable. Smilansky finds libertarian free will improbable and incoherent. He is inclined to agree with determinist thinking. He finds compatibility theories that some human free choice is possible despite a causal universe inadequate. Smilansky, however, is not happy with his conclusions. He maintains that libertarian free will does not exist. Although he is a determinist, perhaps a hard determinist, he argues that without free will, there is no real grounding for morality and responsibility. He does not want the bubble burst for people who have the illusion of free will. He does not believe that naturalists have much reason for their claim that life would go on as usual if the concept of free will were not in place. Most secular thinkers will not find Smilansky's thinking on the necessity of illusion robust. There is a price to be paid for living with a belief that is not corroborated with hard evidence, a gnawing unease that thinking people experience. We are just now beginning to study the effect on people who either believe in free will or do not. Such studies have not yet been very large, and it is difficult to ascertain if they were reliable. But they are tantalizing nevertheless. John Tierney, a political libertarian who writes science articles for the New York Times, wrote an article for the March 22, 2011 issue of the Times concerning free will. He cites some studies that seem to show that when people are under the belief that they are determined, they cheat more on exams. Another study claims that workers who believe in the concept of free will have better job performance ratings. Some researchers see a connection between cheating in college in recent decades and the weakening of the popular belief in free will. This theoretical connection does not seem robust. And once again, the truth or untruth of free will or determinism is not at issue, but the effects of beliefs in them. To we atheists, the question becomes uncomfortably close to the effects or non-effects to society of the existence or non-existence of God, heaven, and hell. A lot of skepticism is in order here. So, we see the shift from truth to what will happen to values and morals if people begin to believe they lack free will. Interestingly enough, although my lecture will not include Eastern considerations of determinism and free will, it appears as though belief in free will might be called a so-called human universal. Certainly, a majority of people in the United States believe that human decision-making is not predicated on determinism. It is unclear if our notion of a certain degree of free will is a cultural specific. Recent studies indicate that in India, Hong Kong, and Colombia, people had a general tendency toward rejecting determinism with regard to human decision-making. These early studies suggest that belief in conscious human decision-making is a cultural universal. To this, Smilansky would reply, of course people have this necessary illusion of free will, and it's good for them. Along these same lines, there is an interesting experiment concerning 3-year-olds. Half of the children in the study were asked about a physical object. The other half were asked about human intentions. The children all saw a box with a sliding lid and a ball on top. When the researcher opened the box, the ball slid into it. Half of the kids were asked if the ball had to touch the bottom of the box, and they all responded yes. The other half saw the researcher open the box, and this time she touched the bottom of it with her hand. When she asked these children if she had to touch the bottom or could she have done something else, those kids, every one, said the experimenter could have done something else besides touch the box's bottom. So much for so many metaphysical discussions on conscious choice. Whether free will is true or not, we humans do seem to have a necessity to believe in it from an early age. Hume and other thinkers such as Gall and Strawson have articulated this fact. There is not anthropological evidence as yet that contradicts the idea that belief in free will is a cultural universal. I do not know if I am unfairly begging the question right now, but I would like to comment on my personal observations. Not only do some determinists get angry when they are wronged, but many like to give advice to friends and family about what their friends and family members ought to do. Study more, diet, exercise, don't buy that car, and etc. The above is prescriptive advice that contradicts determinist belief that people do not make deliberate conscious choices. Some studies have shown that when people are exposed to words associated with aging, at the end of the session, they walked more slowly to the elevator. People who were exposed to many words associated with impoliteness interrupted the experimenter more than those who were exposed to polite words. These actions do not seem to point to conscious choice. But why do philosophers such as Pierboom and Strawson believe that lack of credence in free will should not prove detrimental to society or individuals? There are some preliminary and small studies that indicate that students exposed to ideas of determinism, for instance, did more poorly on exams than students who had not been exposed to such concepts prior to taking the exam. And at the risk of boring you, one of my main points bears repeating again here. What do such arguments have to do with the truth or falsehood of free will? And now we arrive at the compatibilists. The late Harry Frankfurt, a philosopher at Princeton University, is well known for his 2005 small bestseller, Bullshit. But in philosophical circles, his compatibilist account concerning determinism and free will is what has made him a towering figure. He is a major thinker in this area. Frankfurt gave a very sophisticated turn to the dialogue on free will. He stated that humans have desires about desires. I am going to use cigarettes as an example because long ago I was a heavy cigarette smoker, and this is the way I can relate to Frankfurt's discussion of types of addiction and second-order desires. At that time, I had a desire to smoke frequently. I also, as more health reports came out, had the desire not to have the desire for cigarettes. This is what Frankfurt called second-order desire. So I had the lower or first-order desire to smoke and the higher or second-order desire that said, no, I don't want to smoke. I am simplifying here, but that is essentially Frankfurt's point. Frankfurt explains that animals have first-order desires. They might also have two first-order desires at once. A dog might want to go outside, but he might also want to stay in the house and eat his dinner. But as far as we now know, he does not have a second-order desire, such as wishing he did not want a big juicy bone to chew on. He is not conflicted by different desires and the desire not to have those desires as humans are. Frankfurt believes that as we step back and investigate ourselves, we attain free will. He says that happens when you begin acting on the desire you identify yourself with. He goes on to explain that the reason you have this desire or will might be determined, but he believes that is not relevant. What matters is whether this desire you identify yourself with is effective. He uses examples of two kinds of addicts. I will again use cigarette smoking for my examples, a mild addiction. The first person really likes everything about smoking and does not believe or does not care it is harmful. He has identified with his desire to smoke, and when he gets the chance to smoke, he takes it. His desire is effective, and he is exercising his free will. The other smoker identifies with his desire to stop smoking. If he succeeds, he is exercising his free will. If he fails, explains Frankfurt, he is driven by a desire he does not want and does not have free will. Although his argument is not perfect, Frankfurt has taken the free will question to a new and more sophisticated level. Hume and Hobbes had concluded that one's will is basically free if one is not in chains and prevented from acting. Frankfurt says that freedom is having the will one wants. So being in chains does not prevent us from willing that we were not in chains, that we could remove them. This willing, Frankfurt maintains, is the development of our free will. Daniel C. Dennett is a well-known atheist, compatibilist, and proponent of compatibilism in Elbow Room 1984 and Freedom Evolves 2003. Dennett's contribution to the problem of free will and determinism is robust and welcome. In Freedom Evolves 2003, he has significantly added to the great and centuries-long debate between determinism and free will with an extremely cohesive argument for his type of compatibilism. He believes the universe is deterministic, but that humans have evolved from simple life forms to a complex type of freedom that involves culture, cooperation between people, and ethical norms. Dennett prefers to call his stance naturalism, a synthesis of philosophy and natural science. Freedom Evolves discusses determinism, emphasizing that it need not mean fatalism or inevitability. Dennett spent some time examining free will concepts, particularly Robert Kane's theory of libertarian free will. He finds theories such as Kane's lacking. The idea of libertarian free will is rejected by Dennett, and he makes a sound case for rejecting. Too many libertarians attempt to avoid some vague form of fatalism with the notion of quantum indeterminacy, which in reality would only result in swerves of random behavior in humans. Many secular people have assumed scientific determinism is the correct stance. They accept the as yet unproved concept that humans have no volition, and yet these determinists live each day as if they do. Such a contradiction can create an uneasy sense of something being not quite correct, not in some sort of balance, even if the feeling is unspoken. Dennett takes the position that determinism does not mean fatalism. Fatalism is the concept that no matter what one does, both the action and the result are predetermined. Yet a chosen action can make a difference, as we observe in our everyday living, no matter what some philosophers tell us. Dennett explains that different patterns and complexities are being found in all of nature now. The more complex a creature becomes, the more freedom it has. He states that a bird flying has more freedom than a jellyfish which can only float. By contrast, humans have evolved into very complex organisms. Our evolution involves the development of language and culture. Dennett explains that our freedom is as different from a bird's as language is different from bird song. To understand how humans have arrived at this stage of evolved freedom, Dennett takes the reader back in time to understand freedom's more modest components and predecessors. It is not necessary to believe our conscious life is not a superimposition on our material bodies, including the brain. We are evolved creatures who have developed emotions and thought patterns that allow us to make choices and take action on those choices. Instead, Dennett makes a cogent case for compatibility of evolved free will combined with determinism. Our minds and bodies work in tandem. There is not a detached soul doing the driving, as Descartes thought. Whether Dennett is correct or not will hopefully be answered as we learn more about the brain. There is no guarantee of settling the question once and for all. Some thinkers, as Colin McGinn, maintain that we hope to answer the conceptual question of free will with neural information. They do not believe it can be done. This lecture has moved from the theological problem of free will versus determinism to the secular on an intellectual journey through the centuries. When I began this lecture, I said it would not reach conclusions, but I think a few thoughts are in order after the material we have covered. So I will offer my conclusions, which are not prescriptive in the least. They are personal because in the absence of any real knowledge as yet concerning the working of our brains, one is free to adopt any of the stances described tonight. However, my personal belief is that the secular thinker has no need to make a rigid choice between free will, often associated with religion, or determinism, too often associated with moral and ethical permissiveness. There is an apparent compatibility between the two stances. We have just begun to understand how the mind works in tandem with the brain. Colin McGinn points out that the science of the brain has not yet progressed beyond the most elementary descriptive stages. Until the time arrives when science will explain the workings of the brain more thoroughly, secular thinkers can be at ease with the concept that while the universe may be determined, the human brain has volition in the areas that matter, or as Dennett puts it, we have any freedom worth having. Thank you for your attention.